are still joining us, we want to make use of every moment together. Welcome. It is our custom at Holy Blossom Temple to begin a gathering by gratefully acknowledging the land on which we live and learn, work, and pray. We come from across the city, across the continent, and across the ocean. So while I acknowledge where I am and the peoples who have lived here for millennia, you can acknowledge where you are and the many peoples who reside with you, past and present. Holy Blossom Temple rests on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, Chippewa, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. Through a series of treaties, some made in good faith, some made under duress, Toronto is now covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples call us to rise to the challenge of truth and reconciliation and to respond to 96 calls for action. And I will put the link to these calls in the chat box for your consideration. Welcome, everyone. Holy Blossom Temple is honored to be the host and convener of this gathering. It is in the next 90 minutes, with a little imagination, we will create a community that transcends the limits of the screen. We remember what Jewish communal life feels like, so we can quickly converge as a community of learners who love Jewish ideas. We long for community connection so we can easily be bound to one another by our love and admiration for Rabbi Mark Dov Shapiro of blessed memory. Rabbi Shapiro launched his rabbinate here at Holy Blossom. From 1977 to 1982, he cut his rabbinic teeth while serving and leading our congregation. He worked with Rabbi Harvey Fields, alav hashalom, with Rabbi Jim Prosnit, with Rabbi educator Steve Garten, and his office was right next door to senior scholar Rabbi Gunter Plaut of blessed memory. Rabbi Shapiro is remembered for his high energy, hard work, his great teaching and storytelling, and most of all, for his genuine warmth and care for every congregant, young and old, and everywhere in between. Holy Blossom Temple became the springboard for the rest of Mark's rabbinate, from Toronto to White Plains, New York, to Springfield, Massachusetts. Mark died on Tuesday, July 21st, 2020, just a few months after his 70th birthday. His wife, Marcia, decided to bring him home to rest in Toronto, surrounded by some of the very same people of Holy Blossom who once called him their rabbi. During the height of the pandemic, a modest graveside funeral was all we could do. So today we come together in greater numbers, his family and friends, his colleagues and congregants, to remember Rabbi Mark Dov Shapiro, to honor him, to devote our learning to his memory, to his Shem Tov. May we take comfort in one another as we remember him. Just a word or two about housekeeping. Thank you to Naomi Offman for overseeing our live stream today. We are closed captioning the event to maximize accessibility. And with Rabbi Marmer and Rabbi Ellinson's permission, we are also recording this event. So others who weren't able to join us live will be able to find the link on Holy Blossom's website. We are going to keep everyone on mute so there's no distraction from background noise. However, our teachers do invite you to fill the chat box with your comments and commentary and questions. And I will keep my eye on the chat box and draw from among your questions for the 15 minutes that we have reserved for Q&A at the conclusion of the session. You can send in a question at any time and hopefully we'll be able to include it. And finally, a word of gratitude. Rabbi Shapiro had a real knack for making friends and keeping friends. And that was especially true among his classmates and colleagues. Mark would always be seen at rabbinic conventions of the CCAR in hallways and hotel lobbies, between sessions with colleagues of every generation, laughing with them, consoling them, mentoring them, and offering true connection. I know there are many, many rabbis with us today, more than a gaggle of rabbis who have come to remember Mark together with sacred study. He was the best of us. And There is a special circle of rabbis who loved Mark like a brother. They studied together with him every week, and they still study together every week, although now they are diminished without him. That chevre got together to decide what would be the most meaningful way to honor Rabbi Shapiro's legacy. And they chose, with Marcia's blessing, to establish an annual lecture hosted at Holy Blossom and open to all. I want to thank them, Rabbi Simcha Bab, Rabbi Norman Cohen, Rabbi Hesh Summer, and Rabbi Elliot Strom, together with the many donors who have contributed to establish this new fund, this gift of Torah Lishma, which turns our mourning into meaning. So before we launch into study, it is my pleasure to introduce two people who will share some words of loving tribute. First, Mark's son Daniel, and then Rabbi Elliot Strom, who will represent Rabbi Shapiro's circle of lifelong friends and study companions. Rabbi Strom spearheaded this initiative and really is responsible for bringing us together today. So thank you both, and welcome, Daniel.
Hi there, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of my mom and my entire family, really thank you to Holy Blossom and everyone you just named that's making this afternoon session and this lecture series happen. It's a beautiful honor and a fitting celebration of my dad. Even though I've spent my entire life in the States, Toronto is a home for my family. Really, literally in the sense that my cousins and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles are there, but in a deeper way too. It's a part of my family's story. It's where my grandparents set up a life. It's where my Zaidi practiced medicine. It's where my parents grew up. It's where they started their life together. And Holy Blossom is a part of that story too. My dad spoke about it with reverence. I grew up with the Plout commentary in the pews and in hand, and Holy Blossom has retained a sense of bigness and seriousness as this really vibrant, iconic institution of Reform Judaism. And if that wasn't totally doubled down on that beautiful, interesting reflection that you started this talking about where we are and whose land we are on. I just instantly thought of my dad, because that is so a part of the seriousness of thinking and of Blossom and in Reform Judaism, constantly reassessing and reevaluating. So it was so fitting as I read that sentence. And also as my dad's first job in the rabbinate in recent-ish years, as I'm an adult now, apparently, right? As his years at Holy Blossom sort of coincided with my years of being, a young professional, his experience at Holy Blossom became a part of our conversations about the practicalities and the developments of a career, and really all those anecdotes and interests. It's really when that merging of becoming friends with your parent and really being able to dissect that. And Holy Blossom was a part of those conversations. And so here we are on a Holy Blossom Zoom link, honoring my father in a fitting way, because today, and this series going forward, is about learning. And I learned about learning from my dad. It was really and is one of his great enduring gifts from him to me. Learning and listening and asking questions was something that oozed from my dad, whether in this traditional, more study sense that you're talking about, or even when you bring up those hallway conversations. He wanted to know about you. It was his questions. It was his impetus to do that. So I learned from him by observation that learning is part of a rich life. It is part of the fun. And the lesson was and is having an openness, inquisitiveness gives life a sense of wonder. It adds color and dimension to the day-to-day. It is a fundamental experience of being my dad's son. It's a fundamental experience of Judaism. So thank you to my dad for that gift more than anything. And thank you again to everyone that made this happen. So looking forward to experiencing this today, and then definitely this in person and at home in Toronto.
Yashikah. Thank you, Dan. Wonderful, as always, as always. Mark Dov Shapiro, our friend and colleague, was a consummate teacher. He had the unique ability to master sophisticated ideas and then to reach out to his students, heart to heart, soul to soul, and find the language, the approach, the human connection that would motivate them to learn along with him. As I'm sure we all remember, Mark was a brilliant thinker, scholar, and writer. Take, for example, his work in the journal on the Sheva de Nechemta, the series of Haftarah readings meant to provide comfort after Tisha B'Av. It is a very sophisticated work of scholarship, thorough and knowledgeable and wise, impressive in its depth and scope. But what I think made Mark special was his ability to translate such serious Jewish learning so it was clear and accessible to anyone. That was Mark Dove's gift. He could take a challenging subject and with a heart that understood and responded to those he was teaching, make it relevant to them, and so invite them to become his partners in the process of Jewish learning. Just listen to his words from the Shabbat manual that he edited several years ago for our movement. In its early pages, Mark writes, "This is a book about the art of living as it expresses itself through Shabbat. If you are unsure about the significance of Shabbat and are searching for a guidebook, this book is for you. If you are already committed to the Shabbat pause in your life and want to deepen your observance, this book is also for you. Above all else, the premise of this book is that Jewish living involves learning and discovery. Hence the invitation of this book. Read and learn, experience what you can of Shabbat, open Sha'arei Shabbat, and discover the spirit of a day that can mean so much in your life as a Jew." Do you hear it? Do you see? This is quintessential Mark Dove, warm and inclusive. He is inviting you to join him in pursuit of something you might be unfamiliar with, even a little uncomfortable with, and to help you give it a try, to see, with his help, how it might really speak to you. How did he do this? He did it with his playful, sometimes zany sense of humor. He did it with a mind that was orderly, logical, consistent, and true. He did it with his special genius for making the complex simple and straightforward. He did it most of all with a unique ability to invite his students to accompany him on a shared voyage of discovery. Today we honor Mark as teacher with the first of what we hope will be an annual learning opportunity in his memory. I cannot think of a more appropriate way for us to remember him than by learning together as friends, family, and colleagues, for surely that's what his life was all about.
Yasher Koach, Dan, Yasher Koach, Rabbi Strom. It occurs to me that we are more than 100 people gathered now, and if you at any time want to share a memory of Rabbi Shapiro, you're welcome to do so in the chat box, and I believe we would take comfort in one another that way, and certainly Rabbi Shapiro's family would, and his dear friends would. So that's an open invitation. And it will not distract from our learning. It will only enhance our learning, I know. It is now my great honor to introduce two masterful teachers. You know their impressive biographies, so I won't take time away from their teaching to read them. Simply put, Rabbi David Ellinson and Rabbi Michael Marmer are the pride of our Reform movement. They are two champions of our beloved Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. They are inspiration and motivation for generations of rabbinical students and rabbis in Israel and in North America. At CCAR conventions, it doesn't matter what either one of them is teaching, rabbis show up. If either one of them were teaching about Isaac Mayer Wise's mustache, we would still show up because they are the kinds of teachers who make everything seem absolutely fascinating, completely relevant, and urgently important. Rabbi Ellinson and Rabbi Marmer have recently joined forces to produce a new publication, American Jewish Thought Since 1934. Together, they explore questions of theology, loyalty and belonging, the significance of halachic, spiritual, and ritual practice, secularization, and the creative recasting of Jewish peoplehood. This new anthology of Jewish thought reveals how a plurality of approaches emerged in response to the Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the civil rights movement of the last century. Please join me in silent applause to welcome Rabbi David Ellinson and Rabbi Michael Marmer.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Splansky. I'm really extremely appreciative and very moved by your words with which you began today. And I want to thank Dan and I'll say Rabbi Strom, but Elliot, my classmate, for remembering Mark in such a wonderful and meaningful way. For my friends, Rabbi Heshi Summer, Norman Cohen, Simcha Bob, and you, Elliot, I think for all of us, the loss of Mark and the lack of his physical presence is something that diminishes us all. At the very same time, the gratitude we feel and the gifts that he gave us through our interactions with him are quite literally eternal. All of us began at the Hebrew Union College in 1972, so it's been 50 years that we have been together in one way or another. And I do speak as an historian, and Rabbi Splansky and Rabbi Marmer, this is objectively true. The class of 1977 at the Hebrew Union College is by far the most outstanding class that ever entered the College Institute. I am not prejudiced or biased in any way when I make that statement. Rabbi Shapiro, Mark and I were together in Ulpan that year, and my memories of Mark, both from that year and Marcia and my other classmates, and over the past 5 decades, are implanted deeply within my soul. Chazal, our ancient sages, said of Yossi ben Yoezer that he was an ish eshkol, an ish shakol bo. The word eshkol means a cluster, usually a cluster of grapes. But the rabbis understood it to mean a person who had every positive quality. According to our sages, Chazal, when Yossi ben Yoezer passed away, eshkolot, men of this caliber, ceased from being part of the people Israel. Knowing Mark Shapiro, I want to say, and I look at you now, Dan, in particular, your father, that is not true. Your father was such an individual. He possessed, as Rabbi Strom indicated, a remarkable degree of knowledge. His mind was quite literally a steel trap. I do not think there is anyone with whom I have ever spoken that I had greater intellectual respect for than your father. At the same time, he had a remarkable gift. There was a humanity that marked Mark. He never took himself overly seriously. He honored everyone with whom he came into contact. And as Elliot indicated, quoting from his Shabbat manual, he had a rare gift of taking extremely complex kinds of subjects and making that learning available in a very accessible form to everyone whose life he touched. So it is for all these reasons I want to express special thanks to Rabbi Splansky and Holy Blossom Temple and to my classmates, and of course to my colleague, Michael Marmer, for joining me today and allowing me to participate in this session that is in honor of Mark's memory. Yehi zichro baruch. His memory will always be a blessing, and there is no question that we all pray that Kazohar Rakia Mazirim, that his soul continues to shine as the brightness of the firmament. It is a specific and really a singular honor for me to participate today, and I look forward to speaking with Michael about the book that we produced a year ago, published by Brandeis Press, American Jewish Thought Since 1934, and would hope, and I'm actually confident, that Mark would love this kind of discussion. And again, only sorry that he is not here to add his own insights to whatever wisdom it is that Rabbi Marmer will convey to us today. The book, American Jewish Thought Since 1934, let me say a couple of words about the title and how it came to be. Brandeis University has a library, a series in modern Jewish thought, and I was invited to author the book on American Jewish thought, and I said at the time I would do it on one condition, that my colleague Michael Marmer be able to join me in this enterprise. One of the only things, but I would say the major thing that I have missed about not being the president of the Hebrew Union College, it is not fundraising, it is not budgets, it is not all the tensions and pressures that come with the position of president, but Michael served first as dean of the Jerusalem School and then as provost, the chief academic officer during my years as president of the College Institute. And I was able to speak with Michael 4, 5, 6 times a week as we attempted to guide the College Institute together. This book provided us with another opportunity to work together, and for that I remain extremely, extremely grateful. The book had a limit, and I want to point this out. The books are limited to 90 to 100,000 words. I say that because what we soon realized as we created this anthology was that we simply could not put everyone in that we would like to have put in. And indeed, we decided to begin in the mid 20th century with 1934, and we excluded people like Solomon Schechter, Isaac Mayer Wise, Henrietta Zold. I could name any number of other people who might have been included, precisely because there simply was not enough room to include the numbers of persons we did and do the totality of American Jewish history. So a second volume is clearly needed on American Jewish thought, North American Jewish thought from 1654 all the way up to the 20th century. The other thing that we had to decide in this regard, and I'm really mindful with Holy Blossom and a Canadian audience, was what did, in quotes, American mean? And we, of course, decided that that meant, of course, North American, so that people like Emil Fackenheim, it would have been unthinkable not to have included them. Part of what we also attempted to do in the book was to include the writings of figures who you would anticipate would be in an anthology of American Jewish thought. So people like Rabbi Fackenheim, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Mordechai Kaplan, Eugene Borowitz, Judith Plaskow, Rachel Adler. Anyone looking at a book of this type would anticipate these names, Eliezer Berkovitz among Orthodox thinkers. So of course we included all of them, but the editor of the series, Sylvia, made the point to us that we should also include any number of people who are probably not as well known. So people like Sandra Lubarsky and others were included in our book, Julia Watts-Belzer. We tried to include a lot of people so as to introduce them, quite frankly, to people like you if you did not know them, Rabbi Splansky, Rabbi Strom, And the purpose of this was to be able to provide really a broad range of thinkers who have dealt with issues of significant concern to the Jewish people. We then had to also deal with the issue of what would in fact be the topics. And we moved from notions, as it were, of God, Torah, and Israel. Michael will talk about the structure of the book. I will say it took us almost 3 years to put it together. We read thousands and thousands of pages. We condensed them into 3 to 5 pages segments so that we hope we captured the essence of what it was that these persons had to say, while simultaneously recognizing that, of course, all of these persons had much more to add. And we would hope that with skilled teachers, that students of this work would be able to go on and do further study in these persons. We were also very mindful that, for the most part, there were not as many women's voices classically within the canon of American Jewish thought, as there in quotes ought to have been. And in fact, our book from 1934 through about 1980 only contains the writings of several women, people such as Hannah Arendt. After 1980, virtually half the selections are written by women in this work. There are 79 selections, I believe, and Michael can correct me. We have 79 selections, 73 authors, 26 of whom are women. We also attempted to include the voices of people from the persons of color community, from Sephardic Jews, Syrian descent within our community in the selections on peoplehood. And we were mindful of really attempting to cover the waterfront, of course, with the notion of tafasta meruba, lo tafasta. If you try to grab everything, you end up grabbing nothing. There are people whom we excluded. And in fact, when Michael and I did a class on our book last semester at Hebrew Union College, we asked our students, who would you take out and who would you have included in the book that we did not? So as you all ask questions about the book and we get into it today, we are mindful that if you think X should have been in the book and was not included, you're probably right. The only issue is, who would you then have taken out given the word constraint that we have in the book? The last word I'll say in the beginning is that we began in 1934 because that was the year that Mordechai Kaplan wrote Judaism as a Civilization. So we use the work of Rabbi Kaplan as the Archimedean point, the starting point from which we began this exploration of American Jewish thought. And in many ways, I think it's fitting that the book begins with a selection from Rabbi Kaplan, and it ends with Kaplan speaking about Jewish peoplehood. So we move from beginning to end, the alpha and omega in many senses of American Jewish thought can be found in the career of Rabbi Kaplan, though of course, Rabbi Kaplan has been succeeded, and there is a great deal of effervescence and vitality that marks American Jewish thought as we move into the 21st century. Michael will then talk more now about the book and some of the other issues that went into deciding who was and was not American. So Michael, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this event, which is both a tribute and an act of love and memory, and also hopefully, we hope, a contribution to a kind of effervescent debate about stuff that matters. We ended up organizing the materials which David has described to you under 7 headings, 7 rubrics, 7 chapters, each of which has got 10 or 11 little excerpts to be found. We start with God, I suppose, in the hope that God may start with us. And then the second chapter, Revelation and Commandment. The third chapter is on spirituality. We'll return to that for a moment. It's unlikely that any collection of Jewish thought from another period of Jewish creativity would have distinguished spirituality from the earlier sections, say, of God. But part of our argument is that the vocabulary of spirituality is one of the signal contributions of North American Jewish thought over the last several decades, which has come to characterize so much of the discourse. Number 4, we take two, maybe we're cheating in chapter 4, because we call it hermeneutics and politics. Hermeneutics, right? The science, the art of interpretation, and politics, which is politics. I don't know how to describe that. We all sort of know what it is. We argue in this central chapter, numerically in the book, that this is about both the power of interpretation and about the interpretation of power. Two themes that emerge quite strongly in American Jewish thought as we see it. Chapter 5 pairs again two themes. Often they are coupled and often they're considered distinctly: the Holocaust and Israel. Chapter 6, feminism, gender and sexuality, and chapter 7, peoplehood. So those were the themes that we came up with. Let us show you how the book begins here in the introduction. Let's see if this masterpiece of technology actually works. So we begin by noting, as David has already pointed out, that 1934 saw the publication of Kaplan's Judaism as a Civilization. And then noting that another book published that year was entitled The Future of Judaism in America by Eugene Cohn. A sentence from that forgotten work may serve as a watchword, we write, for this present volume. And then this is a quote from Cohn. The conditions under which Judaism must maintain itself, if it is to survive in the modern American environment, are so different from those that have confronted the Jewish people in other times and places that Jews naturally ask themselves what sort of Judaism will emerge as a result of Jewish efforts at adaptation. We might acknowledge, since this is a Holy Blossom event, that this raises or echoes or resonates with an interesting question: the degree to which American exceptionalism is at work in this thinking, where there is a specific question about the United States of America and its unique place in the history of everything. But here, Cohn is setting out a question which we see echoed throughout the sources that we looked at. Things have changed so significantly and are in the process of change that the question becomes, what kind of Judaism, what sort of Judaism is going to emerge as the Jews scramble and sometimes gamble towards these attempts, these efforts at adaptation? And we say that many think what separates us from Cohn in 1934, think what has befallen and unfolded in Jewish history and world history since. And yet, with all of the differences, we concur with his basic insight that in order for Judaism to adapt to America, however you want to understand that term, new kinds of thinking are necessary. I'm going to throw the ball back now to David to say a word about one selection of so many that we could have brought to you that is next up on our list. And this is by Nancy Flam, and it's to be found in the spirituality chapter of the book. David?
Thanks, Michael.
You want full screen or the text?
Okay, just a couple of points that I'd like to make before I discuss Rabbi Flam's particular work here. One issue is that throughout the book, I should point out, if one uses it, we attempted wherever possible to find contrasting opinions. For example, in the section on Israel, we have someone like Judith Butler who is a very, very prominent intellectual and a very strong, I will say, anti-Zionist. And then immediately after, we have Ruth Weiss, who of course is a defender of Israel in every single way and sees Israeli use of power in very positive terms, or a Peter Beinart on the one hand and the editors of Commentary magazine on the other. In this selection from Rabbi Flamm, I want to point out that we began the section on spirituality. And this, I think, is something that is well worth discussing. As Michael said, prior to the year 2000, spirituality was not a major topic, certainly for Jews. In writings we discovered when we Googled after the year 2000, 2005, almost half of everything written Jewishly falls under a rather broad rubric of spirituality. It's certainly a sign of the times that we moved on to this in our work, but we began with, and we don't have his selection here, a work by Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. Many of us, of course, know and knew and revered him in many ways. And he, of course, writes quite critically about spirituality, saying that spirituality is rather ephemeral and it helps to block, as he sees it, traditional Jewish commitments to acting in the world, rather than seeing spirituality as supplementing traditional Jewish concerns for social justice. He sees them as basically being expressions of narcissism. Other thinkers who we include in that section, of course, disagree. And here I want to turn to Rabbi Flamm, who we felt was a highly significant figure. So Michael, good, put her readings back up again. Rabbi Flamm is, of course, a graduate of the Hebrew Union College. She is one of the founders of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And Rabbi Flamm also, of course, is really quite significant for the whole phenomenon of healing services, which of course are a standard part of Jewish worship across the denominations today. And here we want to focus on what Rabbi Flamm said. American Jewry's recent interest in spiritual healing is a fascinating, hopeful, and complex development. It is my understanding that Jewish healing has begun to surface in American Jewish life because it recognizes and accepts human weakness and vulnerability. And during this time of COVID, I suspect Rabbi Flamm's words resonate even more. It has begun to surface because it helps Jews focus upon and nourish our spiritual sensibilities. As an overarching religious sense of brokenness and repair frames many contemporary Jews' experience of the holy, the Jewish healing resources of human relationship, spiritual development, and theological reflection help balm the wounded soul. For many American Jews yearning for a deepened spiritual life, the language, practice, and community of Jewish healing marks the beginning of a deeply personal religious renewal. Here you see ideas that were expressed in the larger world, Rudolf Otto, Das Heilige, the idea of the holy. They begin to find Jewish expression on America's shores in the 1980s and 1990s, and Rabbi Flamm is certainly a key figure in this whole evolution of American Jewish thought during this period. Rabbi Marmer?
Thanks. So as you can see, we do try as much as we can in the course of the work to play point and counterpoint. And this would be our general assertion about these decades of American Jewish thought, American Jewish creativity, that any attempt just to sort of essentialize it down to one or two key tropes or themes is to miss the point about the kind of range of different statements. We, with great joy, begin the spirituality chapter with Wolf's essay Against Spirituality, and then we bring some of the great giants of American Jewish spirituality who have appeared, if you like, to prove him wrong. let's say a word, let's switch theme for a moment and talk about politics and power. The next selection we want to show you may seem familiar to some of you in a different setting, because it actually has found its way into the liturgy of North American reform. This liturgizing trend, by the way, can also be attributed originally to Mordechai Kaplan. One of the things that Kaplan did, for example, with Abraham Joshua Heschel, a man with whom he had many theological differences, was he immediately saw the potential of turning some of this thought into prayer. This next selection is by Michael Walzer, not one of the great liturgical poets of our time, but rather one of the great political theorists. But this essay of his, in which he connects Exodus and liberation, Exodus and politics, this may sound familiar to at least some of you. This I think comes towards the end of his essay. We still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught, or what it has commonly been taken to teach, about the meaning and possibility of politics and about its proper form. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. And here I would just point out, before we move to the next selection, that when we use this term American Jewish thought, it's not only the question that Cohn asked, to what degree does America, the experience of contemporary America, impact our understanding of Judaism, but also, if you like, the reverse question. What can the deep sources of Judaism have to say to our North American moment? And here, Walzer turns to Exodus, the book of Exodus as a literary text, but more than that, the trope of Exodus, the myth of Exodus, as it has played such a central role in the Jewish sensibility, and then applies it, if you like, to our contemporary moment. That this is a version of the theology of liberation, not with the Che Guevara beret and in a Latin American tenor, but rather in a deeply North American context. Mitchell Cohen is less well known than some of the figures. We took delight in our book in bringing to the fore some folks who you may never have heard of. I say this even in view of the fact that there is a rabble of rabbis on this call who have heard of lots of people. I think actually the best collective term is a pride of rabbis. And in any case, there are some thinkers here who you may not have seen, because we deliberately did not want to just revert to the usual suspects. Mitchell Cohen is, David knows him actually, but here he writes a fantastic essay about American Jewish politics using the trope of shatnez. Shatnez, that biblical category according to which wool and linen may not be combined. And this notion of thinking about society and life in general in terms of permitted and forbidden combinations. Okay? Here, let's just take a little look at some of what Cohen writes here. He is a proponent of shatnez. Okay? He says it's better to live with and through modern ambiguities, to wrestle with unreconciled strivings, than to hanker for the easy one-sided resolution. Just as it's better for a society to accept hyphenated citizens rather than impose homogeneity. He's not even a Canadian, and he writes that. Moreover, such one-sidedness and homogeneity cannot be achieved in the end. This doesn't mean that variety, which must come with variance, necessarily stands on its own. He then quotes and modulates Hegel. I think I can spare you all from that. The more pluralism, he writes, within a society, the more vigorous the sense of political citizenship must be, especially within a democracy. And then he comes towards the end of the piece to ask American Jews, in what type of America do you want to live? My answer, as one American Jew, as one rooted cosmopolitan, is that I want to live in an America of democratic citizenship, of social and economic democracy, of liberal tolerance, in a secular state that allows diverse cultures and religions to make of themselves what they will. This America is conceived from a perspective of shatnez, of these combinations. How Judaism fares in it will depend on the cultural life fashioned by American Jews for themselves as a distinct community within the broader society, but nonetheless as full participants in it. And lest you think that tag team is only in wrestling contests, you'll see this is tag team Jewish thought teaching, because I'm now handing over back to David for to say a word perhaps about the next source.
Okay, so let me say a few words about Rabbi Jill Jacobson, just to reemphasize the point that Michael made a moment ago. By including people like Mitchell Cohen, who's a professor of political science at the City University of New York, we purposefully added people who other individuals generally, even the pride of rabbis that Michael mentioned before, of whom you might not be aware. We also talked in our book how, given the disparity as well as diversity and breadth of views, what it might be like. We entitled one presentation we made, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? That we imagined a dinner party where you put someone like Judith Butler next to Ruth Weiss. We don't know if they would have gotten through the first course, much less through the meal and dessert, before an argument would have ensued. We did not include the other figure who represents the binary to Jill Jacobs here, namely Rabbi Meir Kahana. We decided to include a selection by Kahana, and people sometimes ask, did you put anyone in the book whose views you do not approve? I'll speak for myself and then let Michael speak later. I think half the people in the book we have extreme problems with. Rabbi Michael, as the current chair of Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel, represents, I think I can say, a different approach to Judaism and Jewish peoplehood than Rabbi Kahana represented. On the other hand, we felt that Kahana represented a voice that needed to be heard in the American Jewish community. And in the selection we have from Kahana, he is genuinely critical, to put it rather mildly, of liberal Judaism in America. And he uses the notion of the holiday of Hanukkah to say that the holiday of Hanukkah is genuinely not about a search for religious freedom. It represents an attack by the genuine Jews, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, against the Mitbolelim, against the Mityavnim, the Greek assimilationists who mark the community, who one suspects Kahana would identify as us, that is to say, liberal Jews in the modern North American setting. But the respondent to him is Rabbi Jill Jacobs. We'll take a look at her work. Rabbi Jacobs is head of Teruah currently. She is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. She earned her bachelor's degree at Columbia and did a master's degree in city planning at Hunter College of the City University of New York. One of the great gifts of Rabbi Jacobs to the Jewish people is that no one, I think, more than Rabbi Jacobs, has taken the legal teachings of Jewish tradition, particularly from our civil codes. And this means principally, for those of you who are aware, the Choshen Mishpat section of the classical Shulchan Aruch, and applied them to contemporaneous matters of economics in the United States. Indeed, I will say, as a former president of the College Institute, I often saw Rabbi Jacobs as a model for how I would like our rabbis to be, namely, how is it that Jewish tradition can speak to the contemporaneous moment and to issues that confront our people. In her work, she indicates that in looking to classical Jewish sources to address all kinds of issues relating to economic inequality, healthcare, housing in the United States, she makes the following point, that in looking at Jewish tradition, if we succeed in facilitating a rich conversation, we can create a new kind of Jewish politics in America. Rather than trade sound bites, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If not now, when? Rather than trade sound bites, we will continue the Talmudic tradition of dialogue in which various questioners and commentators engage in an often messy conversation that eventually leads to fuller understanding of the situation at hand. Jews who now exercise their commitments to public life outside of the Jewish community may well find then a place within the community. Namely, Rabbi Jacob's point is that Jewish tradition, properly mined and interpreted, can speak to the challenges that confront us today as they contribute their own wisdom and observations to the conversation. Judaism should not be absent from the public square, nor should evangelical Christians have a monopoly on what it is that religion says. Namely, the public square should appropriately be addressed by people who bring religious concerns, tropes, motifs, emphases with them and indicate how this tradition, how the rules and principles of our tradition can speak to public policy commitments that are made in the nations within which we live. Individual Jews and Jewish institutions will strengthen thereby their commitment to public life as the question of how to address current issues become part of the general Jewish conversation. We should talk about Shabbat, Kashrut, and other aspects of Jewish practice, but we need to talk about more. We will witness the emergence of a Judaism that views ritual observance, study, and engagement in the world as an integrated whole rather than as separate and distinct practices. Indeed, since this teaching is in memory and honor of Rabbi Shapiro, I don't know anyone who did that better than Rabbi Shapiro did from his pulpit in Springfield and throughout his career. The Jewish community's deepened involvement in public life will change the face of religious politics in America, as other communities will recognize the Jewish community as an important and authentic religious voice in the public square of America. Here I would make an autobiographical comment. When I was entering the Hebrew Union College, along with Rabbi Shapiro, Rabbi Strom, Rabbi Summer, Rabbi Cohen, Rabbi Bob, for someone like me, the major voices in the North American Jewish community during the 60s, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Reinhold Niebuhr, the Berrigans, the major voices in the public square of American life were people who all had theological training and people who used that training to speak to the issues of our day. Rabbi Jacobs is making the same call now and protesting the monopoly that all too often certain religious groups put forth in dominating discussion in the public square of North America. And in that sense, we felt that Rabbi Jacobs' voice was an important one that needed to be included in this volume.
I'll jump in to the wrestling rink at this moment and say another word. You heard a little bit about our hesitations concerning who's in and who's out. We talked about who is an American and who's a North American, okay? That extends also to the fact that a number of the people who are listed in our book were not born in North America, and a number of them did not end up there. We've mentioned Emil Fackenheim. I can attest through personal my personal testimony that he did not end his days in Canada, because I used to be sent out to buy stamps from the post office when I was his assistant in Jerusalem in the 1980s. But many of these people, including Americans, one thinks of David Hartman, Danny Gordis, Tamar Ross, many of them didn't end up, and a number of these folks, Hannah Arendt, George Steiner, these are not exactly Yankee Doodle dandies. These are folks who came from somewhere else and made a home in America. So that was always a question. I just want to signal another thing. What constitutes thought? In an era in which Bob Dylan can get a Nobel Prize for Literature and deserve it, one has to acknowledge the fact that the traditional parameters by which this stuff gets defined are very different. Some of the finest Jewish thought, one might argue, can be found in poetry, can be found in literature. We tended to limit ourselves to those people who write or have written Jewish thought in a number of established genres. But if you wanted to ask a different question, where have the great Jewish ideas in the experiment of North American Judaism over the last several decades come from? I wonder if you wouldn't find that, Bellow and Malamud and Richler, and there's 1,000 other, I should never start a list that I don't intend to end, but you know what I mean. There's just any number of folks who we could have included. Towards the end of the book, the last section that we noticed is about peoplehood, and peoplehood has become a contested category in the North American Jewish conversation. So we have here, that last chapter begins, as David mentioned, with Mordechai Kaplan, a man who arguably invents the term peoplehood. I don't think anybody's tried to take a patent out on it, but he may indeed have promulgated the word. He certainly brought it into a kind of currency. Listen to Kaplan here. An American Jewish community which would be animated by the status of Jewish peoplehood, would foster Jewish educational and cultural activities designed to make the collective experience of Jewish living in past and present a means for personal and social self-fulfillment. It would encourage Jewish community collaboration with other liberal elements in the American population for realizing in American life the highest ideals which Jews have learned from their own history and religion. The religion which seeks to make of peoplehood a way of salvation for the individual and society is the only kind of religion that can make the world safe for democracy. Peoplehood is crucial to the Kaplanian worldview. Now fast forward to Shaul Magid, who writes an important work according to which we are in a post-peoplehood, post-ethnic moment in the American Jewish conversation. Shaul Magid, an extremely significant scholar of Judaism, but also in his own right a thinker, somebody who's, roughly speaking, you might say, aligned with trends within Jewish renewal on the American Jewish religious spectrum. And he observes, both as a scholar and, if you like, as a theoretician of this, that America is being transformed from a multiculturalist and ethnocentric society to a post-ethnic society. And this change undermines, or at least problematizes, the place of ethnicity in American identity that dominated the second part of the 20th century. The Jewish collective in America, he predicts, will survive. It will just look different than before. The normalization of intermarriage, combined with a fairly new phenomenon of the intermarried Jew remaining part of a Jewish community and bringing their spouse and children into that community, raises new issues about the very construction of a Jewish collective that includes non-Jews. This post-ethnic approach considers young men and women who own multiple narratives, family histories, and affiliations without a sense of disparity. Here you see something of the stretch, of the range of conversation. Kaplan writing, the piece that we include there is a post-war Kaplan piece. He is locked into a notion of peoplehood He doesn't hold with a supernatural view of God. He doesn't hold with the idea of the chosenness of the Jewish people, but he passionately holds with the idea of the centrality of Jewish peoplehood. Shaul Magid is challenging these categories and wondering what American Judaism looks like when they are attenuated and changed. We're now on the final lap. Let's just include this line from Magid. One can contest and or lament the reality that is emerging and even try to institute measures to prevent it, but one cannot turn a blind eye to the changing contours of Jewishness in contemporary America. David, okay. I'm exhausted. It's your turn.
Okay, a few points I want to make just to emphasize what it is that Michael has said. By ending with Jewish peoplehood, and I see we didn't really include any selections today from God, Mitzvah, and Revelation. And in that sense, it's because we made a conscious decision. We only had an hour and a half. And of course, I will tell at least a story. When I began teaching at the Hebrew Union College and was appointed to the faculty, I remember that in my interview in Los Angeles in '79, I remember saying to Stanley Chiat, a teacher of many of us, how in the world am I going to be able to handle a class for 90 minutes? What will I have to say? And Chiat said, don't worry. After you teach for a couple of weeks, you're going to simply wonder, how can 90 minutes even contain the brilliance that you will have to share with your students? Little did I know in my humility how true that would come to be. But because of the time constraints, and we hope there'll be some discussion, we did exclude a lot. But I want to make a couple of additional comments about what Michael just said there. When Kaplan was writing about the concept of Jewish peoplehood, ethnically, the Jewish community was a homogeneous community. There was virtually no intermarriage. In terms of the history of Jews in the United States, the first significant percentage in the modern period of intermarried Jews comes in 1970. The 1970 Jewish population study, which involved the grandchildren of Eastern European immigrants, the rate of intermarriage, a Jew marrying someone born non-Jewish, was about 30%. In the 1950s, it was less than 10%. By 1990, the figure had reached 52% in the 1990 population study. And remember, 50% intermarriage rate, given how it's counted, means 2/3 of your families are intermarried. And by 2012, and certainly the most recent Pew study, 70% of the non-Orthodox Jewish community in the United States marries people who were born non-Jewish. We live, as Magid puts it, in a post-ethnic Jewish world. By the way, Magid himself, while his doctorate is from Brandeis University, was ordained an Orthodox rabbi in Israel. He teaches now at Dartmouth College. He basically makes the point that post-ethnicity means that the Jewish community and its homogeneity, ethnically, religiously, the amount of endogamy in marriage that marked the Jewish community previously is simply not true in the age in which we live. He does not lament that. He sees that as an opportunity. And in recent studies that have been done, there are quite literally in the United States, and I look at Rabbi Splansky, she can tell us about Canada, there are probably close to 2 million people in the United States who live with Jews. They often take their children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, brothers-in-law, sisters-in-law to Jewish temples, synagogue events. They participate in Jewish life. The question is, are these people part of the Jewish community? Are they not part of it? Leaving aside the formal questions of rabbinic officiation and intermarriage, we have a community today that is ethnically diverse in a way that was never true before. Simultaneously, the other point I wish to make, Jewish thought in general always reflects the larger environment in which Jews find themselves. People like Maimonides and others begin to write a guide for the perplexed when they live in an Islamic culture in which religious teachings are expressed in philosophical form. Here in the United States, the recent Pew study indicates that the United States is a country of changers. Less than 25% of Americans altogether belong or identify with the religious denomination into which they were born. In other words, at a time in which people talk about ethnicity, race, what it is to be a person of color, the reality is that there is an ethnic diversity and elements of change that were unparalleled in the Jewish experience. And we have someone like Maggid who says, there's no point not only in lamenting that fact, we should celebrate it. We did not include here, but there's an essay by Jack Wertheimer and Stephen Cohen in which they say, no, we should lament it. It's not so good for the Jewish people. But I want to conclude with two last selections that reflect this diversity in other ways as well. So Michael, if you could turn, first, I want to look at the writing of Diane Kohler-Esses. Rabbi Kohler-Esses teaches, or is a rabbi at Romemu. She is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. She is the first Syrian woman, S-Y-R-I-A-N, to become a rabbi. And she grew up, of course, in a Syrian Orthodox community, but went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. And in her article, she talks about what it was to become part of the seminary community, part of the larger North American Jewish world in which the Ashkenazic heritage is emphasized, and her own Jewishness, that of a Sephardic Jew from Syrian background, virtually ignored. So she writes, as a modern American Jew in her own community, she could not have become a rabbi. Informed by feminism, she left her world and comes to the Jewish Theological Seminary and be ordained as a conservative rabbi. But she also observes, I often experience being pulled, painfully taught by two competing and contradictory histories, those of the East, of Mizrach, and the Ma'arab, the West. Perhaps when or if I can give rise to a new internal vision in which each does not contradict the other, but one looks to the totality of the Jewish experience, I can begin to speak a language common to Jews of all types, East and West. Perhaps there will be a day when a Jewish voice will be raised with the deep understanding of the vast multiplicity of the Jewish people, offering a world vision in healing the painful and violent terrain between East and West, a prophetic vision in which the lion can lie with the lamb and East and West do not have to destroy one another. And we'll conclude with the writings of Lewis Gordon, a philosopher who did his doctorate at Yale, teaches at the University of Connecticut, born of a Jamaican Jewish mother. And Professor Gordon writes the following: knowing much about the diversity of Jewish communities worldwide is one thing. Sitting in a room with nearly 100 representatives of such communities is another matter. In other words, the reality of human interface, think of Levinas. What is it not only to speak of the other, what is it to confront the other, to see the face of the other? I participated in the 2002 B'chol Lashon International Think Tank, which brought together Jews of all types and all varieties, organized by the late Gary Tobin of San Francisco, where I was able to see the beautiful tapestry of Jews from a broad range of backgrounds, orientations, and races. It became clear to me as I participated that something special was being realized in this wonderful community of hope, a new stage in the history of the Jewish people. It is post-denominational, pan-denominational, post-racial, and pan-racial. It is what Judaism has always been. We are a people. Peoplehood involves taking seriously the diversity of Jews and the complexity of our histories. It involves taking on the fallacies that have been imposed on our past, namely that all of us, in quotes, are descended from an Ashken normative background in the service of a false, homogeneous identity that Professor Gordon charges has encouraged bigotry. It is these kinds of selections that we include in our book. I want to emphasize Michael and I in the book, we're completely committed to presenting the views. We have footnotes where there need to be explanations given to the readers of the references that our authors make. But this is an anthology. We do not take any position in our book, either in agreement or disagreement with the selections that are put forth, whether it be Judith Butler or the Satmar Rebbe, who charges the Zionist with every evil that has incurred to the Jewish people, to my colleague and friend Rachel Adler, to Judith Plaskow. And what we hope that we have created is a banquet where everyone can genuinely come to dinner and where these voices can be heard. And we hope that this book will be used by many people to teach and demonstrate and display the complexity, diversity, effervescence, and vitality of what Shimon Ravidovich, who is included in this book, once said is the ever dying but always living people. Michael, do you want a last word here?
I never want a last word after you, David. I think what we've tried to do is gallop through a few of the sources to give folks a sense of what we've been trying to do in this work. There are 1 or 2 million more things we might say, but I don't think we should try to. Yael, Rabbi Splansky, we're happy to hand this back to you to see if there are responses, distress signals, signs of life, questions, comments which we can relate to.
Thank you. So if anyone would like to put a question in the chat box, it's not too late. This is the time to do that. And for Rabbis Ellinson and Marmer, I'll draw one that came just to the hosts and panelists. It comes from Rabbi Jesse Pakin of Toronto. At the beginning, you spoke a bit about non-European Jews. I wonder how much your editorial hand takes into account the different impact of Western, that is, German versus Eastern European ideas of the very nature of religion and Judaism. It seems to me, Rabbi Pakin writes, that demographic distinction is a strong dividing line between America and Canada. And he is a Canadian who spent significant time in America, so he is one to know. As still a mostly United States collection, does your volume mainly consider Judaism in 20th century German terms? Question mark.
So I'll take a first stab at that question. Hi, Jesse. It's great to hear from you, and it's a good question. There is a German bias. That for all I know, there's a German bias in David and myself, although neither of us can claim in good conscience to be Yekis. But there is a German bias that's inherent in the way that Jewish thought has been practiced, taught, and perpetuated in America, or in North America in general, although I accept the point about an interesting point here between a distinction to be made. There's an essay that we reference, I think, at the end of the book by Zach Breiteman, in which he talks about that perhaps the end of a German moment in American Jewish thought and the dawn of an American moment where folks have moved farther away. But many of the people, not only in our seminary world, but in the university world in general, I can't help, I'll mention that in a second. So there is a German bias, number one. Number two, we do give voice, you heard, to non-European voices and also to East European voices. Perhaps the primary, in the American Jewish thought world, the person still with us who's made arguably the most significant contribution to recalibrating that would be Arthur Greene. Art says about his influences that they are overwhelmingly, that the ones that have most inspired him and guided him are those who were informed by and inspired by Hasidism and an East European spiritual heritage. He writes in a recent book that he's published, Art Greene, that he had trouble taking Mordechai Kaplan seriously because Mordechai Kaplan did not speak with a European accent. He had come to believe in the course of his education that any really smart Jewish teacher would have to sound like, you know, they were from Central Casting doing either a Central European accent of one kind or another. So I think the question is an excellent one. If you did a demographic survey of the people in our book, you would see a spread, but there is a bias towards a certain German tradition. This is an intellectual tradition inspired by Moses Mendelssohn and Hermann Cohen and Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber. These folks were, for a whole generation of people who taught and practiced Jewish thought in America, they were the canon, okay? It is true that in the last few years, that canon has been altered, challenged, and changed. David, is there anything you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add to that is you need to, look, first, I'm very appreciative of what Rabbi Hake and Debbie asked. I think it's a superb question. And
Jesse, I think it was Jesse Pakin, not Debbie Haken.
Oh, I apologize. I misunderstood then. Well, I'm still very appreciative of the question. It's a superb question. One needs to also keep in mind, beyond what Michael said about Art's point of Art trying to represent what I call an Eastern Europeanization of American Jewish thought, that when you think of really three of the most classical North American Jewish thinkers, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who came from Europe, Rabbi Heschel, and Rabbi Kaplan, all three of them are of Eastern European descent, but two of them, you know, with Rabbi Soloveitchik, were all trained in German universities. Kaplan certainly trained at the City University and Columbia. These people were trained, in quotes, in a Teutonic tradition. There is no question about it. But the issue will be, how will that change? Clearly, Art means to Eastern Europeanize Jewish thought, and he draws on people like Heschel and Zeitlin, and Heschel too, of course, trained in a German university. So that would be the only place in which I would supplement what it was that Michael said so well.
So there's another good question here about the expansion of the canon. The question comes from Sharoni Sibini, who is the new adult education coordinator here at Holy Blossom. She says, wonderful project, wonderful talk. I'd love to know more about your inclusion of renewal voices like Zalman Schachter Shalomi or Jill Hammer, the Kohenet movement, as well as the Aleph school that's been gaining traction in the last few years.
Yeah, I'll start with that and then Michael can add. I would add that in our spirituality section, I just pulled the book out. We include not only Zalman within the work, who of course is undoubtedly the teacher of people like Maggid, and in many ways, Art Greene. I guess Art and Zalman really play a significant role as, in quotes, fathers of renewal. But we include Danny Matt, we have Marcia Prager, Sheila Weinberg, and others. Part of what you raise in your question is simply how many people we could include. All of these people are voices that undoubtedly have a claim to be part of our book. And I would add that we include at the very end of the book a bibliography of 50 works, authors of whom were not included in the book, namely in our selections for what we would call further readings. And then in the areas of feminism, gender, sexuality, people like Julia Watts-Belzer of Georgetown University, who's a renewal rabbi, Jay Michelson towards a queer Jewish theology, B'nai Lappi, the new rabbi, who is the Rosh Yeshiva at Svara, a queer yeshiva in Chicago, Joy Ladin, representing a transgendered theological voice. We did our best to include representatives of a wide diversity of what I think could be called legitimately renewal opinions or renewal views, even as, of course, we hardly exhausted it. Michael, anything you want to add to that?
All the names you mentioned are indeed here in our book. Jill Hammer, who was part of the question that we were asked, together with Taya Sher, writes a book called The Hebrew Priestess. It's not excerpted in our book, but it is in that list of 50 books at the end. In other words, we recognize that strand, that voice is an important one. I'm going to take a minute, if I have, to take a section from the spirituality book, which we didn't include on the page, but always moves me when I come across it. There were a lot of surprises working on this book. Again, the riches to be found out there in the North American Jewish conversation, but also pieces that I had never seen or hadn't seen for years and that kind of grabbed me. This is from the end of a section written by Sheila Peltz-Weinberg, who's a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and very involved in Jewish mindfulness teaching and so on. Listen to these words. Again, this is not, even in the Hasidic world, you wouldn't find, I would argue, a Jewish kind of spiritual voice of this tenor at another time in our history. It's an interesting moment. As I look back upon my life from the momentary calm of the rock's shelter, what do I see? I see signs of a presence, footprints in the sand, glimpses of a back, a face, a hand, a moment of risking liberation, a moment of embracing creation. There were times in my life when I was ready to say yes or no in a strong enough voice to make a new boundary. This is how I understand the God of liberation. There were other moments when the truth of my own belonging burst through into the light of awareness. This is how I understand the God of creation. These accumulated moments pass through times of change, fear, loss, uncertainty, and pain. They teach me that I am worthy and responsible. My actions matter. I am part of something greater than myself. I am not alone and am not lost.
I would love to end right there. However, one more important question has come through, and I know it's a question that both rabbis take very seriously and are comfortable addressing. So for fear of coming across as if we're ducking it, I'm just going to go for it. The question is, what if any kind of acknowledgement is made in the volume about those voices included who are now suspected of inappropriate conduct of one kind or another? How was their inclusion wrestled with?
Okay, great question. I'm happy to respond to it. There have been three major people who have elicited negative responses. And people have asked us, and Michael may have more, how we could possibly include them. One person, I don't think it had anything to do with her conduct. Her conduct, it has to do with her views. That is to say, Judith Butler. Judith Butler's, the perception of her as being anti-Zionist. There are a number of people who have, when we have delivered lectures on this book, have said, how could you possibly have included Judith Butler in a work on American Jewish thought? Her work is destructive of of Judaism and of the Zionist state, and she certainly does not belong in a work of this type, and you have elevated her by so including her. I mentioned earlier Meir Kahane, and that, by the way, might even include people in our families who have said, how could you dare to put Meir Kahane in this work? His views are such an anathema to so many, and he represents a racist interpretation of Judaism that runs counter to virtually any argument one might say of decency that one would put forth on the Jewish scene. And then finally, Stephen Cohen, who resigned from the faculty of Hebrew Union College because of sexual misdeeds and misbehavior. Michael and I discussed the inclusion of all of these people and probably more. Our feeling in this regard was that intellectual honesty demanded that all these voices be included. In other words, even if one were to contend, as indeed a number of persons have, that Professor Cohen's views are a reflection and an extension of his sexual improprieties, there is no question that Stephen Cohen was really one of the most significant voices on the American Jewish scene for many, many years. I would want to distinguish between any attempt to legitimate or justify what those behaviors were and the inclusion of such people in an anthology. Or to draw an analogy, if I were teaching a course in the history of political theory in the United States in the pre-Civil War South, I don't know how I would not include John C. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification. I don't know how one could understand the political debates in the antebellum United States without looking at the work of John C. Calhoun. Simultaneously, I might not name a dormitory at Yale College after him. I think these are ongoing kinds of discussions, but at least I would say that for me, the intellectual record demanded the inclusion of voices whose conduct I might well disapprove. I quote Heidegger. He is admittedly a Nazi who attempted to destroy my people, and yet if I'm teaching phenomenology, I include his voice. I recognize that it is a contentious type of topic, but at least this is where Michael and I ended up. Michael, last word?
Yeah, well, I want to. The question that we were asked is, did we agonize about this? And I can confidently say that David and I agonized about most things to do with this work, and this for sure. And I would say that much of our deliberations were held in the spirit of Samuel Beckett's famous words, fail again, fail better. We do not pretend to have got these judgment calls right in all cases. We have tried. It's in the case of Stephen Cohen, I think the Cohen case is different than the other two that we're talking about. Although it is true that we did not know some questions relating to Kahane's appropriateness in the sexual area have also come to light. This is not something of which we were aware. With regards to Steve, if this book is graced to get to another edition, another printing, there will be each thinker in the book has a little paragraph of biographical background, and we have been impressed by this debate to add a sentence to that characterization of Cohen that puts out there the fact of his departure from the faculty of the college. To the question of, we were convinced and remain convinced that in setting out this dyad of opinions, Magid saying it's a post-ethnic moment and Wertheimer and Cohen saying, oh no, it isn't, or it shouldn't be, we wanted to put that into the conversation. We wanted to be that to be part of the record. Have we got this right? Can one get this right in the current situation in which a very important work of uncovering painful aspects. I mean, Yael, I think of how you began this this session today. We are living through a time in which that which was considered unworthy of mention or unmentionable has now is now being brought to the fore. David and I do not pretend to be trendsetters or thought leaders in this regard. We're trying to work out what's the best way and most appropriate way of responding to this. So we have failed, but we're trying to fail better.
Thank you. Our time has flown by, and I hate to bring this study to conclusion, but Rabbi Ellinson has another classroom of students waiting for him, and it's after 10 o'clock at night for Rabbi Marmer in Jerusalem. So you can continue this learning by buying the book, American Jewish Thought Since 1934. Sukkot was just a few weeks ago. Today's learning reminds me of the Sukkot custom of ushpizin, of inviting invisible guests to join us for a feast in our sukkah. Today, with Rabbi Ellinson and Rabbi Marmer as our brilliant curators and our trustworthy guides, we were able to enter into the good company and be challenged by the good ideas of just 9 leading Jewish thinkers. If you would like to continue to fill your study table, your sukkah, your reading room, your feasting table with more good company and more good ideas, buy the book, and you will be stimulated by this collection of leading voices which shape the North American Jewish identity. I am personally very grateful to 2 of my favorite teachers anywhere, Rabbi David Ellinson and Rabbi Michael Marmer. And for concluding remarks, it is my honor to welcome Judy Winberg, who is the immediate past president of Holy Blossom Temple, an extraordinary leader of the Greater Toronto Jewish community, and a lifelong friend of Rabbi Mark Dov Shapiro.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sklansky. I will be brief. A couple of comments were made in the chat. Mark would have loved this. Mark would have loved this. He would be quelling. For all of us to be able to be together to learn from these 2 esteemed teachers on the occasion of the inaugural lecture in memory of Rabbi Mark Dov Shapiro is a gift. I too would like to thank Rabbi Ellinson, Rabbi Marmer for sharing your wisdom today, and I've already looked on Amazon to see that I can get the book. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Elliot Strom and Dan Shapiro and Marcia Shapiro for bringing this together with your other rabbinic colleagues to honor Mark's legacy. It really, it's the first. It's so exciting that this will continue again on an annual basis. Mark and Marcia may have left Toronto, but always knew that this was home. With the worst of the pandemic behind us now, Marcia and Daniel can visit again, and I'm so looking forward to that. Rest assured, Marcia and Daniel, that whenever you're here, that Toronto, your Holy Blossom is your Toronto spiritual home and your sacred community here. I'm honored to be asked to conclude as the past president of Holy Blossom Temple, but also, as you said, as a longtime friend. I was 10 when I met Mark. He was 12, and the last time I saw him, we'd all grown up a little. He officiated at my children's wedding almost 5 years ago. It was a highlight. Holy Blossom has a long tradition of exceptional rabbis and meaningful programs. With the esteemed Rabbi Plaut as his mentor, the young Rabbi Shapiro brought so much to the temple. He was actively involved with the religious school, with young families, with senior groups, and especially with social justice programming. He began work with refugee families arriving from Vietnam and helped set the agenda for Holy Blossom's long-standing direct involvement with families starting their new lives in Canada. He also understood the significance of honoring the past and respecting the elders in his community. And I remember so often when he came to visit his mom, so often when she was living at Baycrest. Mark was instrumental in the formation of what has now become Toronto Holocaust Education Week. We thank him for that. We have so much to thank Rabbi Mark Shapiro for. I am so looking forward to celebrating his memory again at the next lecture series. Again, I thank you all for joining us today. I can never have the last word. I turn back to my rabbi. We'll
end where we began, which is with overflowing gratitude for our teachers and our rabbis. And right at the center of our thoughts and our memories today is an extraordinary rabbi and teacher, Rabbi Mark Dov Shapiro, Zichrono Livracha. Be well, everyone.